As Shanda said, I'm with NIACS, Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, which is a multi-organizational partnership. I myself work for Michigan Tech. I'm a research associate professor. The very first thing I want to do before I dive in is talk about the role that other people have played in this work. I'm just the messenger. I lead these assessments, but if not for these partners over the course of now 5 published papers I'm going to be summarizing for you here, none of this would have happened. So it's not as much fun as real soils work, but it does take a lot of people just the same. If I have to convince you that soil carbon is important, well, I'd start by pointing out that soils are the largest of all terrestrial carbon pools. That's globally, where twice as much soil as you would find in all plants and the atmosphere is underneath our feet. And it's true at the site level. In any given forest ecosystem, at least in temperate and boreal climates, 50 to 70% of all the carbon in that ecosystem is in the soil. So there's a lot of it. It's also the basis of a whole lot of different ecosystem functions, ranging from water holding capacity, nutrient recycling, pollutant absorption, so many things, biodiversity preservation through the detrital food webs that are based on soil organic matter. And just because there's a lot of it sitting around doesn't mean it's just sitting around. Climate and land use change, disturbances, kinds of management systems and specific prescriptions within them, all of those things have the potential to influence soil carbon. When we started doing this work now close to 20 years ago, we had a pretty broad motivating question at that time. It really wasn't even known at that point whether forest management had any consistent effect on soil carbon in temperate forests. So we went about this broad question with a pretty broad approach. We used literature review and meta-analysis, which calculates a relative change in some metric of interest, in this case soil carbon, in response to some kind of intervention, in this case different types of management. It took years. We sifted through thousands of papers, landed on hundreds, and from those papers calculated thousands of response ratios. These are these percentage changes in soil carbon with a fire or fertilization, for example. And in keeping with this broad motivating question, we came up with some pretty broad answers. Well, harvesting tended to reduce soil carbon by 8%, fires by 26%, and nitrogen fertilization increase soil carbon by 8%. This is across global temperate forests. I gotta ask you, anybody on here manage a global temperate forest? How useful are these numbers? We did a little bit better than that. I'm being cheeky. We found some nuance to these findings. One of which is that if you care about soil carbon, probably whether you realize it or not, you care more about soil carbon stocks, the amount that is there, than about soil carbon concentrations, which tells you more about the soil characteristics. The carbon stock from an ecosystem carbon budgeting point of view, from a water holding capacity point of view, soil carbon stocks, when harvested, tend to decline by about 13% with a bootstrapped confidence interval of 4%. So this was the first time that there had been any publication showing that there was in fact a significant change in soil carbon stocks with harvest. We found that overall decline of 13% was really driven by the forest floor, the litter layer, the organic horizon. Mineral soils in general do not change carbon stocks. We found some nuance to this. If you look at the lower right-hand figure, these are results by soil taxonomic order. Sometimes people call that soil type. We're looking at alpha sols and septisols, spodosols and ultisols here. And I'm just pointing out to you that different orders showed different responses. And within a given soil order, the things that seemed to matter to harvest effects were different. On the lower left, this is a recovery curve for spodosol forest floors. So you think of your cold, wet northern forests and that thick litter layer on the surface. Sure, there's an initial decline, but over the course of decades, a longer-term recovery of carbon stocks after harvesting. So these weren't just single number estimates we were coming up with here. We had some nuance to these findings. Nonetheless, I would say, how useful are these averages and uncertainties to you? How do you know if they apply to your project area? These are results of a global biome level analysis. We took this soil taxonomic dependency, this different results as a function of soil type, to mean that maybe the answer isn't the same everywhere. We know that soil carbon stocks are not the same everywhere. That's true across the country, that's true across a landscape, that's true along a hill slope. The things that control how much soil carbon is in a place, those baseline controls on soil carbon stocks, those aren't geographically consistent. In some places it's more about soil texture. In some places it's probably more about climate or disturbance. So why wouldn't management effects on soil carbon stocks also be geographically variable? And we came to this realization and the need for a new approach as managing forests for carbon, or at least with carbon in mind, was starting to become more common. And nonetheless, people were leaving soils out of the discussion and focusing really on biomass or perhaps fuels. In the interim, between the results that I showed you in the previous slide, which were work basically done in the late 2000s when we kicked this off, and the time we picked up the approach I'm going to share with you today in the late 20-teens, the data exploded. It's true in every part of science. There's more data now than ever, and that enables us to use tools like the ones we used 15, 20 years ago, only at large scales, now at management relevant scales, where soils vary, where soil carbon stocks vary. And what I'm going to share with you now is this ecoregional approach that we've now published 6 times altogether. And I'll start in the Northeast because I was told that this is where many of you work, and certainly this was the most involved of these ecoregional soil carbon assessments that we've done to date. So how do we do this? Well, our first step is to define a study area. We tend to align with states and ecological criteria. This work really came out of state climate action plans in the 20-teens, and we had to align with the fact that states are real, meaningful units at which management and policy happen. But as ecologists, we couldn't stomach the idea of drawing a line at a state boundary. So we settled on the Forest Service EcoMap framework, which delineates ecologically consistent sections. In this case, it's hierarchical. We chose to work at the section level. And that's how we define our ecoregions. We then synthesize data through literature review. So we find published papers about harvest or fire management to do that meta-analysis, that percent change in carbon stock across all the papers on a given topic. We use FIA plot data. I hope I don't need to explain that abbreviation. We use soil survey data and remote sensing to look at what has changed at the locations of soil pedon sampling, and then kind of assess how soil carbon stocks change in response to land use change or management across these 3 different data sources. And that enables us to judge our confidence, to assess whether the results we find by one data source are consistent across others. And for each ecoregion, we start by assessing what are the baseline controls on carbon stocks. Okay, we know how much is where, what is driving that? And then we look at the effects of land use change and management on those carbon stocks. And a third part of each ecoregion is to develop decision support tools. This isn't just about publishing papers, although that is my primary job. We like to do work that is useful to people, so we come up with a range of different products to try and help with that. In the Northeast, we come up with things like this, tables that describe the controlling influence of different factors on existing soil carbon stocks. I'm not going to go through this whole table, but I'm going to help you orient to it. This is where we want to know what controls how much soil carbon is where in the first place. And we tend to look at this either in surface soils on the left, this is O and A horizons, organic horizons and topsoils. And on the right, this is the whole soil profile, which in the Northeast is either to 50 centimeters or however deep could be sampled based on where the bedrock is. And what you see where there are orange highlights, these are factors that tend to be associated with more soil carbon, and blue are factors that are associated with less. And I've grouped them by type so you can appreciate things like in organic horizons, notice that we see, these are sorted by strength of influence. You see predictable relationships. So not surprisingly, when you have sapric organic matter or histosols or clay or things like this, these are all associated with more carbon in your surface soils. Farther down the list, we tend to see things like land use change and vegetation. And I could do a whole talk just on the contents of this table, but that's not why anybody's here. What we really want to know is what's going on with soil carbon. How is it changing? I suspect many people are aware of what happened and is happening with forest cover, with land use change in the Northeast. It's been on a bit of a roller coaster and it's going down again. What does this mean for soil carbon? Well, here's what it means. This is a meta-analysis figure. The dotted vertical line is basically no net change in soil carbon due to the factor named on the left. So where you have a point with uncertainties that overlap zero, like in the case of forest harvesting, that means that intervention doesn't affect soil carbon stock. Where you're to the left of the dotted line, these are declines in soil carbon stock, and if you're to the right, these are gains. So over that long history of deforestation, reforestation, and deforestation anew, we know that deforestation initially decreased soil carbon. Reforestation tends to be associated with increasing soil carbon, and where there's deforestation happening again, soil carbon is going down again. So land use change is really important in the Northeast. We learned some things about reforestation. We use meta-analysis to probe underlying sources of variation in the effects of a certain land use change or management. And we see things that are, I would say, logically consistent with first principles and the literature on the topic. So wherever you've got forests growing where there was farming, wherever there's reforestation, those soils are gaining O-horizon carbon. But the magnitude and variability of those increases depend on site factors like the past agricultural practices. Look at the top of this figure. We're comparing the change in soil carbon stock, O-horizon carbon stock, for soils that were previously cultivated versus ones that were just pasture or meadow. And we see a larger O-horizon carbon gain when the soil had been cultivated before. We see an influence of forest type, so conifers, perhaps not surprisingly, tend to be associated with larger organic horizon gains during reforestation than deciduous tree species, and so on. We see parent material influences, we see different parts of the O-horizon showing different responses. What I want to stress here is that this is all based on what we have studied to date. This is about the past. This is looking at studies that have examined paired comparisons, say in the woods on one side of the fence row that was once grazed and on the other side of the fence row that was never grazed. What does the future hold? If it's more of this, soil warming experiment at Hubbard Brook. If it's more of this, last fall's fires, I don't know. But I can tell you that organic horizon carbon gains are not going to be as stable as changes in the mineral soil because all that organic matter on the surface is unprotected. It can accumulate quite rapidly, it can decline quite rapidly, but it's dynamic. So it is responsive, and when we see changes in the O horizon, we have to recognize those may be short-lived in either direction. As you might guess, these ecoregional assessments tend to be kind of dense and lengthy papers. We try to do, I'll say, a whole ass job, which should be my only cuss word for the day. We try to address it all. Anywhere the data will let us go, we follow the data and we answer the questions we can. So we end up usually incorporating some sort of a table in each paper that kind of distills down all of our findings into the things that matter most for an executive summary. And the ones that I'll really stress here for the Northeast are, to me, the fact that it's all about land use change. Forest harvesting, no matter how you look at it, in the Northeast has no significant effect on soil carbon. I have never worked so hard to pull together metadata, ancillary variables, to try and come up with factors, forest type, harvest system, slope, soil texture, all of it, expecting those things to be significant constraints on a management effect, and it's just nothing. Harvesting does not seem to matter to soil carbon in the Northeast. There are well-known exceptions, individual studies that show an effect, typically a loss, sometimes a gain, but those are the exceptions. We find at ecoregional down to landscape scales, there is no effect of harvesting. We do find that there might be some elements of vulnerability in certain settings. For example, spodosols, northern and boreal tree communities like the swamp conifers, steep slopes, and south-facing aspects, we find some evidence in our data, very limited, low confidence, I guess we said medium here, that there might be some vulnerability of O-horizon carbon in those settings. And if you're a person or you're working with a client who has low risk tolerance, then you might wish to take a special care if doing harvesting in those settings. So that's where I'll leave it for the Northeast. I'll just mention that another way we boil down our findings are through fact sheets. We've done 2 of these with our partners at McCasey, which has supported some of this work. 2-pagers, basically, that summarize the findings of these regional assessments. And there was also, thanks to Ali Kasiba, a NESAF News Quarterly article that I got to pull together on our findings from this paper. Tend to be written more for the executive summary and manager audience than these lengthy papers. All right, I'm going to turn now to the Lake States. This was the second in the series, and in my view, it is still probably the most useful, not because I know and love the Lake States, but because of what our findings were. So here's how we defined the Lake States. Basically, the 3 that border the Great Lakes to the full extent of the ecological sections present within them. So at an ecoregional level, I'm going to guide you through this, don't freak out. We found a remarkably consistent effect of harvesting on A-horizon carbon stocks. Each of these 3 panels shows one of the 3 data sources I mentioned earlier. Vertically, we're looking at a soil profile. O-horizons on the top, A-horizons are the topsoils, EB, the deeper parent material horizons, and then the whole profile. And in my professional career, I've never seen such concurrence as this. Across the 3 data sources, harvesting was associated with a decline in topsoil carbon somewhere between 17 and 20%. When I first saw this, I thought, boy, this is a big deal. This implies that all across the Lake States, harvesting is decreasing soil carbon. Certainly there are people who would like this to mean that and might even claim that it does. But when you look deeper into the data, when you take a landscape view, and this is all in this paper, you find that the effect is not so clear-cut. I'm going to call your attention to the red circled figures here, soil texture and parent material. In the Lake States, there are these predictable parent materials juxtaposed against each other. You have moraines of till that were deposited directly by the wasting continental ice. You have the outwash parent materials that flowed off of the wasting ice in the meltwater, and then you have glaciolacustran parent materials that formed underneath quiet water where the meltwater went to settle. And these generally follow soil textural gradients as well. What we found in these meta-analysis figures here is that generally the intermediate soil textures like sandy loams tended to lose soil carbon with harvesting, and finer soil textures gain soil carbon with harvesting. These textures, as I mentioned, co-vary with parent material to a certain degree, so we find that outwash and outwash mantled till parent materials tend to lose soil carbon with harvesting, and glaciolacustran, these lake plains with their fine soils, tend to gain soil carbon. I think I'm going to ignore this figure on the right unless people want more of a physiography and soils lecture for later. We can come back to it. What I'm going to stress here is what we found, which is that beneath this seemingly consistent regional effect, there's a really important landscape pattern. And that's why, to me, this was the most useful of these analyses. We can map parent material and soil texture. And since we know across multiple data sources for each of these, multiple data sources of our three showed us the same things. Parent material and soil texture influence how much soil carbon is there and how it responds to harvest. We were able to make this map of probable change in soil carbon based on harvest. And this map has, to date, seen a bit of use by our partners as they plan where they do management and how they do management. The how aspect is something we address in another of our decision support tools. For some of our regional assessments, we've developed these tables of soil carbon management tactics. If anyone here is familiar with work that Todd Ontel of NIAX led some years ago on the carbon menu that ties together climate adaptation and carbon management, we supplemented that with a soil-specific table for some of these individual regions. And we look at existing management guidelines, BMPs, state requirements where they exist, and we come up with tactics that you might be able to employ for certain harvest types or in certain settings, and how those would help to protect or increase soil carbon. And then we supplement that with a literature review to show the degree of support for those tactics. Now I'll take you on a tour of what is actually two ecoregional assessments. Our very first proof of concept was focused on the state of Maryland. That's where the interest was, that's where the funding was. We couldn't bear just to work in the state of Maryland, so we looked at the ecological sections present in Maryland and followed them to their outer limits. And we wound up calling this the Central Appalachians and Mid-Atlantic ecoregion. Later on, we did one that was the South Atlantic, and that's the sort of yellowish here down into the Carolinas and so on. So I'm going to move through these two assessments together, even though one was the first and the other one I think was the fourth. In the Central Appalachians and Mid-Atlantic, what I'm showing you here is two sources of data addressing land use change and management effects on soil carbon stocks. On the left-hand side, this is that meta-analysis again, showing that harvesting in this ecoregion doesn't tend to change soil carbon stocks. Various types of land use change decrease soil carbon stocks, and fire also does the same. On the right-hand side, we can make some comparisons using the soil survey data and remote sensing to tell us what's going on with land use at that place. Hey, look, natural forest, let's ignore the baggage in that term, let's unharvested forest, how about that? Control, reference forest, compared to harvested forest. We see overlapping error bars. Both of those conditions have soil carbon stocks in their surface soils of 40 to 60 megagrams per hectare. That lack of a difference is supported in the case of the meta-analysis by no net change. Well look, if we compare developed soil carbon stocks all the way down here, the B superscript point that is the second from the bottom on the right-hand panel, That B means it's significantly different from the A of natural forest. If you convert a forest to developed land, you probably lose soil carbon. And we see that reflected in the negative effect of land use change on the left-hand panel. Similarly, look at the top 2 points on the right-hand side, natural wetlands versus restored wetlands in former agricultural lands. A lot less soil carbon in the restored wetlands. That would also affirm that land use change is having an effect on soil carbon stock. Unlike other ecoregions since, this was one where, at least in the surface soils, land use and management were pretty consistently important. Usually we find that it's the bottom-up factors, it's soil texture, it's parent material, it's climate, something like that is really what dominates how much soil carbon is present in a place. The Central Alps and Mid-Atlantic was a place where we saw that what people are doing does seem to matter. That intersects with how soils differ naturally. Look at this beautiful range of properties in the soil orders present across this study region. Why wouldn't you expect soils that look this different to have different soil carbon stocks? That's the profile SOC. Look at this great range of variation. 100, 200 tons carbon per hectare in 3 of these soil orders, all the way down to 62 in the case of the entasols. These soils differ in their depth, particularly the inceptisols and spotisols. These are the wet, cold mountain soils. Think of the Allegheny front, the highlands of western Maryland. These have pretty shallow profiles. It's shallow to bedrock. You come down onto the coastal plain, Piedmont, you're looking at much deeper soils. And another thing that matters a lot about the differences in these soils, you kind of see looking at their pictures, is how much of what they hold in their whole profile is in that top 10 centimeters, is in the part of the profile that's physically vulnerable, say to machine traffic or erosion, things that might happen when you're doing harvesting in rugged topography. And the ones that really stand out here are probably the spotisols, because they are the shallowest. They store a very large, fully a third of their carbon is in the top 10 centimeters. And they got a lot of carbon. So we might think that spotisols are going to be more vulnerable to soil carbon losses with harvesting than maybe a soil order that has a very deep depth distribution, like a mollisol. Those are present in certain places in this study area, and only 14% of their carbon is present in the top 10 centimeter. Another finding of our analysis here, the meta-analysis in particular, is that underneath that overall no change in soil carbon with harvest, on the left-hand side here, there's a significant effect of soil order and topography. Sloping settings and landforms tend to lose surface soil carbon. So we take that along with this depth distribution, profile depth, and carbon stock information, and make a tool that shows a vulnerability score that helps people understand how the soil carbon stock is likely to change with harvesting in different parts of the study area. Now I'll take you to the South Atlantic. I'm going to stick with a couple of these soil orders. Inceptisols and ultisols are 2 soil orders that are really like night and day and really cover a large fraction of the area in the South Atlantic. These 2 soil orders really integrate the baseline relationships we see between soil carbon stocks, climate, and topography. If you know Romance languages, you will recognize in inceptisol the root incept, the beginning, the inception. These are young soils formed and recently deposited, often, let's say, like colluvial materials, where you have fresh inputs of sediment due to slope erosion in a mountainous setting. Inceptisols tend to be in the cooler, wetter, steeper, younger part of the South Atlantic, in the Blue Ridge, up in the western part of North Carolina and in the mountains. Ultisols, ultus, the last. These are very mature, weathered soils found down onto the Piedmont and all the way out onto the coastal plain. So what I'm showing you here is, I'm going to keep moving. I'm telling you about baseline factors and how they influence soil carbon, and trying to prime you for the idea that we might see those baseline factors coming back to influence how those soil carbon stocks respond to management. In terms of those management effects regionally, in the South Atlantic, harvesting tends to increase soil carbon. Fire tends to decrease it. Where there has been reforestation, we see gains in soil carbon, and where we see deforestation, there tend to be losses. So starting to see some general patterns here. I also hope you'll see a general pattern in what I've told you several times now, which is that underneath an overall effect at the regional scale, we see sub-regional detail that matters. We see things like ultisols gaining soil carbon with harvest and inceptisols losing it. We see inceptisols losing more soil carbon than ultisols when there's a fire. So let's start to think about how that might influence the way a state plans its management, or the way you might approach land management at, say, a landscape scale, where you have these soil orders co-occurring. Inceptisols tend to be your steeper, wetter, more mesic, less disturbance adapted systems. These are your mountain hardwoods. Ultisols tend to be pines. These are the coastal plain forests. These are the incredible production, our wood basket. What we wound up doing for the South Atlantic was looking at specific practices. One of the benefits of high data density in this region is that we could get really specific on individual practices and how they affect soil carbon. Mostly, it's not about the practice, it's about the place. That's what tends to influence how much soil carbon is in a place and how it responds to harvest or fire or land use change. But in the Southeast, the abundant literature and probably the magnitude of the practices that we're talking about, those things really matter. When you're talking about coastal plain pine forestry, things like residue burning, using herbicides to diminish or control the competing vegetation and get better stand establishment, these are things that decrease soil carbon storage, as shown in this figure on the left. Doing other things don't seem to matter, and then some other things seem to maybe increase soil carbon. So if you're familiar with this part of the country, tillage is pretty commonly applied when reestablishing the next rotation. Bedding is also pretty common on wet sites where the residues and the surface soils are bedded up, and then the seedlings are planted on those beds. That looks like a way to increase soil carbon, perhaps by burying those harvest residues in waterlogged conditions. So what we wound up doing in this case was to develop one of these soil carbon tactics tables that recognize differences in management regime, so rugged mountain hardwoods, inceptisols, versus the coastal pine plantations. The things that you would do to affect soil carbon in those different kinds of systems differ because of the ways those systems are different. And that's one of the real takeaways of all this work, is that we're trying to help people work at that more site-specific scale and think about what they have and how that influences what you might choose to do. Extending rotation length probably doesn't make any sense in a coastal pine plantation where it's all about volume production in as little time as possible. On the other hand, not raking the pine straw and selling it as animal bedding, that might be a thing that could result in more carbon sequestered over the course of a rotation there. And now for the last ecoregion, this one we just published last month, the central hardwoods, which we define increasingly by what we haven't studied already. But basically we're looking at the western flank of the Appalachian Divide all the way through the upper portions of the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys. Really, this is oak country. To some extent mixed mesophytic forest, but a lot of the literature that we wind up reviewing here is about oak systems, some about pine, and not surprisingly, our most insightful findings then are about fire management, given that that is such an important consideration in these central hardwood and mixed systems. And here's another meta-analysis figure. So again, that dotted vertical line is a no change in organic horizon carbon stock. We found that was really the responsive portion of the profile, once again, was that surface organic matter. And for example, if we look at different ways of measuring an organic horizon, when you burn it, its carbon concentration doesn't change. Carbon is still, 30 or 40% of what's there in those dead leaves and that greasy black humus. However, and this shouldn't be surprising, it's a mass change. That's what fire does. It takes away matter and sends it to the atmosphere. So we like seeing results like we see on the top here. They affirm what we think we knew and make the obvious evident. If we look at different parts of the O horizon, depending on when you learned your soils, you learned an O horizon, or where, I suppose, you learned an O horizon either as an L, an F, or an H sublayers, or maybe you learned it as an OI, OE, and OA, but this is a little vertical profile in an O horizon where the litter, the fresh litter layer of the O horizon is very much diminished by fire. Studies that sampled the litter and the fragmented litter, so the last few years of litter, those show large O horizon declines. And the studies that sampled the deeper parts of the O horizon, the fragmented fibrous litter along with the humus, those tend to not change. So we tend to see the declines on the top of the O horizon. Anybody surprised? I'm not. But here are the numbers. You can use them. Season of burn seems to matter. Spring burns being associated with significant declines in O horizon carbon, whereas burns that are done either in the winter or in the winter-spring shoulder don't tend to lose. See an effect of, let's say physiographic position. Intermediate tends to be the slightly drier, more upper parts of hill slopes. Those tend to decline, whereas submesic, farther down the slopes, maybe a little bit wetter, don't change. Their horizons are not affected by prescribed fire. And then we see some effect of forest type. Pine, oak systems, any component of pine. One of the things we found in the central hardwoods, this is one of our other data sources, one of the baseline controls on O horizon carbon stock was whether there is pine there or not. Another finding. Anybody surprised? You walk into a pine stand from a hardwood stand, usually there's more of an O horizon. It's that needle litter. Thicker stuff, less affected by fire. It's those mixed mesic hardwoods and oak hickory systems that seem to show O horizon carbon stock declines with prescribed fire in the central hardwoods. So, whirlwind tour, but I want to get you on your way down Carbon Road. What I want to leave you with is the idea that it's not a one-way street. Anybody who offers you a broad generalization about management effects on soil carbon, I would be skeptical, because pretty much everywhere I've looked for the last 20 years, I've found a slightly different answer. It's usually for a reason that makes sense. The reason that we've done these ecoregional analyses is because we think they allow us to use the available data effectively, and they strike a good balance between really broad generalizations that have questionable broader applicability and site specificity, where you really don't know whether an individual site level study is representative of your site or not. The key takeaways of all this work to me, in addition to the few I've mentioned along the way, are that management effects on soil carbon are usually small, especially compared to natural variability. It's the things that are out there like topography, parent material, drainage, texture, climate. These are the things that affect how much carbon is in a place. Land use change, that starts to get interesting. Land use change does tend to have a bigger effect than a management effect. And the real takeaway for that is that if we're talking about forest management and carbon, It's not about whether we're managing a forest or not. It's about whether that forest is staying a forest. I think I've stressed that where management is done has a bigger influence on soil carbon stocks than how management is done. That's a pretty reliable takeaway across most of these ecoregional assessments. And the last thing I will stress is that in those instances where we find that management has some effect, those effects are usually superficial. They're on the O horizon or maybe the topsoil. They're small in magnitude and they don't last forever. So it really becomes then about what you can do to protect the surface of the soil from physical or microclimatic change due to management and help it get back to what it was before management, if your management has any effect. So that's what I brought. I'm willing to entertain questions, and I hope you've got some. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Luke. We do have a few questions in the chat, so we can start there. So Jake Mayer, I think it was pretty early in your presentation, you showed a decrease in carbon by 13%. Maybe we can get back to that slide.
Oh,
And he
sure,
was
yeah.
wondering how long it took for that decrease to happen.
Let me figure out how to get my share back. Okay, yeah, so this was the meta-analysis figure from our early work on harvest impacts on soil carbon stocks. So that was this one, right?
Yes, yeah, that's correct.
All right, I'm enough flustered by the technology that I've basically forgotten the question and the name of the person.
Yeah, it was Jake Mayer, and he
Okay.
was wondering how long it took for that decrease to happen.
Hmm. Yes, Jake has asked one of the top three questions that everyone always asks about a meta-analysis, which was how long. When you do meta-analysis, the analogy is you're trying to take apples and oranges and put them all in one basket just to learn about fruit. So this is everything from studies where, um, maybe it was one study was a research group went out before a harvest and then 6 months later, and they compared the carbon stock 6 months later to what was there before. And this is studies where another research group went to a place that had been harvested 40 years ago, and they sampled the area harvested 40 years ago and then an adjacent stand that was not harvested. And all of these different comparisons we normalize to this effect size. So what's the treatment value for carbon stock and what's the control? So this is all time scales. I bet that Jake and many others can guess that the time frame tends to be biased young, funding cycles, career lengths, institutional change. These are always things, these are evergreen reasons why we lack long-term information. When we do have some longer-term view, like this years since harvest figure, this isn't where somebody waited 80 years and then went out and resampled. This is a chronosequence, and that's one of the other it's got its limitations, but it's one of the more powerful designs for getting at these longer term trends. So a research group goes out and samples stands that were harvested, not at all, so that's your reference, and then 20, 40, 60, 80 years prior to the time of sampling. And that's how you get at the longer term trajectories. But generally, Jake, these are fairly short term responses. These are on the order of years to a decade.
Great,
I'll
thank
leave
you
my
for that.
slides up if that makes sense.
And then let's see, we had another question from Michael. He says he's always wanted to ask what intermediate moisture is and why it is a desirable state for lower impact logging.
Oh, that must be in reference, Michael, to one of these last figures from the central hardwoods. in this case, so there, I think this is a McNabb. These physiographic classes, intermediate, submesic, mesic, xeric, these are arrayed. Okay, yes, I see your comment, Michael. You're talking not about stable physiographic patterns in moisture, but maybe the table of tactics for the lake states. Yeah, so under harvesting under moisture conditions, well, I think most often people are concerned with wet ground in the lake states because there are obvious issues with physical damage to soils on wet ground. I I'd say we with this paper wanted to start steering people towards the idea of intermediate moisture because in the lake states, often the most permissive soils from an operating season limit are outwash soils. People have just accepted for a long time that outwash soils dry out well because they tend to be medium to coarse textured. So you can operate on them pretty much any time of the year. What we found with this assessment is that soil carbon stocks on outwash soils are actually quite vulnerable. So to the extent that that vulnerability is related to physical destruction of soil structure, that is going to be least likely at intermediate conditions. If it's wet, rutting is an issue. If it's too dry, what limited, let's say, aggregation as a soil physical process, the limited amount of structural stability that outwash soils do have is less than at an intermediate moisture state. So for folks that are wishing to avoid those impacts, it would be ideal to protect those outwash soils partly by when they're operated on and also through things like slash armoring. What else?
We have a question from Carla, who asks, could you elaborate a bit more on how the vulnerability score was calculated?
Is this for the Central Apps and Mid-Atlantic? I believe that was where
Yeah, Carla, you're welcome to either unmute or put into the chat and clarify what that question specifically was on. We can move on and come back to that one. And let Carla either unmute or add something to the chat. Let me scroll down. Let's see. I think we had one other. Oh yeah, Jake had a follow-up question. How long does it take the forest to build the levels back up? Are these similar timeframes or shorter or longer in average in Maine?
was that in Maine in
In
particular?
Maine, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what part of the soil you're talking about. I would say that generally, I'm going to step outside the specific published findings of each paper now and think more broadly as a person who studies soil organic matter, cycling, residence times. O horizons tend to change on a time scale of years to decades. So if you lose O horizon carbon, you're presumably talking about years to decades to get it back. If it's mineral soil carbon, so the A horizon, the topsoil, or deeper down, that carbon tends to reflect processes that operate and integrate over decades to many centuries. So in the case of gains or losses in the mineral soil, those ought to be more stable. The one ecoregion I didn't talk about here was the Pacific Northwest. I think it's probably the most impactful findings showing that harvesting does not tend to affect soil carbon, but fires decrease soil carbon. And that decrease is in the O horizon, the A horizon, and the B horizon. So all parts of the profile. This is really a big deal. And we find particularly That is true of wildfires more than prescribed fires, and of high severity wildfires more than low severity fires. So where you have effects that get down into the mineral soil, these are going to be more persistent changes in soil carbon stocks. And I would just say it's my personal view is that as the climate and disturbance regimes everywhere tend to change faster and faster, what we can tell by looking to the past is probably going to get less and less certain. Thus, what we think we know about the future based on studying the past becomes harder and harder to tell. Okay, so that I did see the comment flash for a moment there. This was a question about Central Apps and Mid-Atlantic and these vulnerability scores. So this map reflects basically index values that we assigned based on soil order. So we use Surgo, to those who are familiar with that, to look at dominant map unit for each polygon, and then slope gradient. So based on our findings that sloping landforms showed surface soil carbon stock declines, and our result that, with harvest, I mean, just to carry that through, and our result that certain soil orders have more of their carbon in those surface layers. We know where we find those soil orders in conjunction with steep topography. We're going to map that as a higher vulnerability index, and then areas that have lower topographic gradients or soils that have a deeper depth distribution of their whole carbon stock, those are going to be less vulnerable to harvest. And I'll mention this map was not part of the paper. The paper was just the findings. The map was a product we created after the fact.
We have a question from Michael Fitzgibbon. I wonder if Michael might want to unmute to ask this. That might be a bit easier.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, there were 4 questions, and I was just going to let you choose which ones would be more productive with the short time you have left. I don't have a favorite, but one is what is protecting carbon in the soil where there's no effect by management? I suspect it's quick regeneration that covers the soil and keeps the leakage of carbon down.
I would turn your question on its head, Michael. I don't presume that there is any effect to begin with. So I don't see the absence of an effect as a protective mechanism. I would say it's that other things matter more. It's not about what we're doing under normal management, poking around on the surface of the ground. That just doesn't rise to the level of something that the soil carbon, with its centuries and millennia of accumulation, really even responds to. The other thing it reflects is that it's really, really hard to sample enough to detect the tiny, tiny, tiny change when it does happen. So that would be my response to that.
Okay, thanks. You can try some other questions.
We have another one from Carla. She says, related to your findings in the Northeast, you made me think about comparisons we like to use when modeling soil organic carbon managed versus non-managed forests. Maybe we have to look for more useful comparisons / scenarios. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I guess this is great engagement. So thank you for all these questions. It's fun just to get lost in it all with all of you. So thank you. I mean that. I guess when I think of modeling soil carbon in the Northeast, man, I go right to Hubbard Brook, which is like the type locality for where people think of for soil, harvesting and soil carbon loss in New England. That is one study with the clear cut experiment was totally outside of operational bounds. You just don't see any forestry done like that. I'll note that a lot of the literature on forest harvest and soil carbon in the Northeast is about clear cuts, far in proportion of how often they actually happen. So I think one issue is that there is not enough study of the far more common partial harvest systems. Um, I would suspect if you were gonna find an effect, you would probably find it with a more intensive kind of management. And even with that literature bias towards that more intensive management, there just doesn't seem to be an effect. Um, I don't really know what to say beyond that. Usually in other ecoregions, as you've hopefully seen, we can say, okay, there is or is not an effect overall regionally, but then beneath that we see that forest type matters, or we always try to tell silvicultural system prescription level of detail if we can. Those things, just none of it mattered in the Northeast. I would say, honestly, stop looking for it and start focusing on land use change. That's really where the impact is. Um, uh, Carbon management and harvesting in the Northeast, sure, biomass, yeah, that changes a lot. How much you leave on site, what you do with what's removed, like that matters, but the carbon isn't the place to look. I hope that's addressed your question.
I think we may have time for just one more. So we'll go with John Irwin's. Were carbon stocks in areas with higher equipment intensity, such as more and higher road soil disturbance, such as steep slopes affected? Let me re-ask that. I kind of butchered it. I'm sorry. Were carbon stocks in areas with higher equipment intensity, more and higher road soil disturbance, such as steep slopes affected?
Yeah, it's hard to get at that. I mean, the way most of these studies happen, some ecologists go out and then they walk through a woods that was harvested and they sample here and there, and then they do the same thing in one that wasn't. And there are very few studies that look at gradients of disturbance intensity. There's some of that work that's been done in the lake states on a few national forests within the last few years, looking at a gradient of physical disturbance. I have never been able to address that. I've tried. Best thing I can do is refer to first principles. Probably the 10% of the harvested footprint that is in haul roads, log landings, and decks, those are probably the places where you'd find the bigger impacts. And then the 90% where the only thing that happened is some trees are gone now, those are probably not the places where the impacts are. But that's kind of me speculating from first principles.
Since I think we're just about at the end of time, I wanted to butt in. Xander Evans, I work for the Forest Stewards Guild, and I want to thank Luke. Awesome. It's really yeah, I'm gonna re-watch the recording because I gotta like learn all this stuff. There, you presented a lot of great information. And I really appreciate you taking so much work and putting it into one presentation. And Shanda, thank you so much for hosting. You did a great job. And I also want to thank everybody for participating. I know there's a lot going on in the world, and I think it's wonderful to have so many people get online to think about soils and these complex relationships. So, really appreciate it. This is the sort of thing that's inspiring for me. So, thanks to everybody.
Agreed. Yeah, thank you all. It's fun to get together and talk ideas. Feel free to reach out if you have follow-up questions.
Great.
Thanks for the opportunity and your attention, everybody.
Thanks. And I think Shanda, you can close us out here. Thank
Great.
you.
All right. Well, thank you all so much. And we will be posting the recording of this as well if anybody else would like to rewatch. And have a wonderful rest of your day.
Okay, you do the
All
same.
right.
Bye.
Bye.